Nobody warned Matt Brown that telling the truth would cost him everything. He grew up on camera, built a life that millions of Americans watched unfold across their television screens every Friday night, and when the show was finally done with him, he did something that the rest of his family refused to do. He told the truth. He confessed to the lies that had held them all together, the constructed myth that a network had sold and a family had performed, and one by one, the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally walked away. By the end, there was very little left, and on May 31st, 2026, his older brother Bear sat in front of a camera, barely holding himself together, and told the world that Matt was gone. His body had been recovered from the Okanogan River in northeastern Washington. He was 43 years old. This is the story of how he got there and why it matters far beyond the Brown family and the Discovery Channel. Bear's announcement that morning was one of the hardest things to watch, not just because of the news itself, but because of a detail that could easily get buried beneath the weight of it. Bear explained that his brother Noah had been part of the private search party that located Matt's body. Noah was the one who helped pull him out of the water. Noah was the one who stood at that riverbank and made the identification. When you pause on what that moment actually felt like, when you let it land rather than process it at a distance, you begin to understand that the grief inside that family in the days that followed was not one wave, but an entire succession of them, each one arriving before the previous one had finished. Bear also pushed back against what had been spreading online, the suggestion that the family had simply abandoned Matt and left him to collapse alone. He insisted the situation was layered and complicated in ways that no headline or comment section could ever properly hold. But then he said something that deserves to stop you completely still. He mentioned that in one of Matt's final videos, Matt had spoken openly about how much the negative comments on his posts had hurt him. And Bear looked directly into his camera and said what most people already know, but almost never act on. The person on the other side of your screen is a real human being, and sometimes words cause damage that no fist ever could. That is not a throwaway line at the end of a grief announcement. That is a man telling you, as directly as he possibly can, that the cruelty his brother absorbed from strangers on the internet played a genuine role in how things ended. The official search for Matt had begun 5 days earlier, on Wednesday, May 27, 2026, when a 911 caller reported seeing a man sitting in the shallows of the Okanogan River near Oroville, Washington. The caller looked away for only a moment. When they turned back, the man was face down in the current and drifting. A family member separately reported having seen Matt that same morning near the Driscoll Island Wildlife Area, roughly a mile from where the emergency call was made. A backpack was recovered near the water, with an empty holster inside, and the gun was believed to be submerged somewhere downstream. Dispatch audio obtained by multiple outlets referenced a suicidal man who had reportedly shot himself before entering the river, though that detail had not been officially confirmed at the time of Bear's announcement. The Okanogan County Sheriff's Office launched a full response involving divers, cadaver dogs, sonar equipment, and a boat crew from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Brother Gabe was reported at the scene and in contact with police. For 2 days, the search continued, methodical and grim. Then a severe storm moved through the area and made the river conditions too dangerous to continue safely. The official search was suspended. On Friday, May 29th, Bear posted publicly for the first time, saying he believed his brother was gone. He said he had been told Matt had taken his own life near the river, and that while he was holding on to the smallest imaginable chance that the information was wrong, he was already preparing himself for the worst. His voice carried the particular weight of someone who has already accepted a truth they are desperately hoping to be incorrect about. He said something else in that video that deserves to be heard. He said he had never thought Matt would hurt himself. He had always worried about the addiction, about an overdose, about substances finally winning the way they so often do. But this, he said, he would not have predicted. 2 days later, a private search party found the body. Noah identified his brother. Bear went live and told the world. You could argue that this is where the story ends. But the 5 days between May 27th and May 31st are only comprehensible if you understand what Matt's life had looked like in the weeks and months before anyone knew to go looking for him. Long before a 911 caller looked away from a stranger in a river, there were warning signs broadcasting in plain sight that almost nobody watching knew how to read. Matt's mother, Ami Brown, 61 years old and already weakened by years of serious health battles, including a lung cancer diagnosis in 2017 and multiple pneumonia hospitalizations in recent years, had been rushed to the hospital on April 11, 2026, dealing with COVID and pneumonia simultaneously. The family was already operating under serious strain before the May events even began. Matt, meanwhile, was still posting to his YouTube channel and Instagram in the weeks before he disappeared. His channel biography described a man living a quiet and free life in recovery, devoted to self-growth and useful entertainment. The gap between that description and what was actually happening becomes unbearable in retrospect. Around the middle of May, Matt live-streamed himself in a public park in Washington, appearing visibly confused and distressed. Reports described him as possibly intoxicated, behaving in a way that disturbed people watching in real time. This was not a recovery update or an adventure video. This was a person in a visible crisis broadcasting it live to an audience of strangers who had no meaningful way to reach through the screen and help him. And then there was May 10th, roughly 3 weeks before his death. Matt posted a video that day describing how he had spent the previous night sleeping in a cemetery because he had been unable to find anywhere safe to sleep. He mentioned that his late father had once told him cemeteries were good resting places while traveling because nobody would disturb you there. He had laid down between 2 graves. Then he looked into his camera, gestured to his head and his heart, and told his audience he was good, thanking everyone for their support and encouragement. He was sleeping alone in a graveyard, drawing comfort from advice his dead father had given him years before, and broadcasting to the internet that he was perfectly fine. And the vast majority of the people who watched it believed him and moved on to the next video in their feed. To understand why Matt was sleeping in a cemetery with almost nothing and nowhere to go, you have to go back to a single video from 2021 that completed his isolation from the people who were supposed to be his family. Billy Brown died on February 7th, 2021, at 68 years old after suffering a seizure. Bear announced it on Instagram and described his father as their best friend and one of a kind. The grief from the show's audience was immediate and enormous. Matt reportedly reconciled with Billy before his death and made it home to say goodbye. But when Season 13 aired its memorial episode titled One Last Dance, Matt's scenes had been cut from the broadcast entirely. The family appeared on screen. He did not. No public explanation was ever offered for whose decision that was or why it happened the way it did. 2 months later, on April 11th, 2021, Matt sat down alone outside at night and recorded a video that became one of the most discussed moments in the entire history of the show. Barely visible against the dark sky behind him, he said he knew he was not supposed to share other people's secrets, but that those secrets were destroying him. He said he was cold and had almost nothing to eat, and then, piece by piece, he began dismantling the myth his family had spent a decade building in front of millions of viewers. He said the show had misrepresented how the family actually lived. He alleged that producers had supplied his parents with drugs and specifically named cocaine, and that this had contributed to the environment in which his own addiction developed. He alleged that his father had controlled all of the money the family earned from the show, and that he personally had been denied access to roughly $360,000 he said he found documented in paperwork his mother processed after Billy's death. He said that when he asked his mother for $100 for food, she told him no. Bear responded quickly and without hesitation, calling the claims horrible lies told about a man who had passed just months earlier and saying Matt needed professional help. Discovery Channel never responded publicly. The specific allegations have never been independently verified and remain Matt's account alone. But look at what was actually happening in that video. Whatever the precise truth of every claim, you are watching a man who spent years carrying the weight of a manufactured story sitting alone in the dark with barely any food, deciding he was finally done protecting it. That is not a performance. That is someone who has run out of reasons to pretend, and the response for most of his family was to pull back further rather than draw closer. The estrangement that the campfire confession completed had not begun in 2021. It had been building for nearly a decade, through a spiral that the cameras sometimes captured and mostly did not. The first public sign of Matt's private war appeared before the show even aired. On August 30th, 2013, he borrowed a woman's car after drinking at a bar in Juneau, struck a parked motorcycle in a parking lot, and drove away from the scene. When police caught up with him, his blood alcohol level was nearly twice Alaska's legal limit. In February of 2014, he was sentenced to 3 days in jail and 18 months of probation. Most of the show's audience never knew about it. By 2016, things had deteriorated badly enough that Matt entered inpatient treatment for 35 days. He spoke about it honestly in an interview with People magazine afterward, saying he could see himself spiraling, that he had grown withdrawn and slower, that the things which used to excite him no longer did. He traced the beginning of the drinking back to a long period in Juneau, where he had gradually started spending time with people who drank heavily, and what began occasionally became more and more over time. When he came out of treatment, he sounded genuinely hopeful. He told the same publication that he had turned his weakness into a strength, and that not everyone makes it back from where he had been. He was glad to be one of the ones who did. That hope did not hold. By 2018, Matt had relapsed and entered the Betty Ford Center in California. Billy told reporters they would rather lose him from home for a little while than lose him forever. Nobody in that conversation knew how those words would sound 8 years later. After that second treatment stint, Matt never returned to the show. The family relocated to Washington State without him. Around the same time, 2 women came forward with allegations that Matt had sexually assaulted them in separate incidents in California. The Los Angeles County District Attorney reviewed the matter and declined to prosecute due to insufficient evidence, and no charges were ever filed. But the combination of the relapse, the departure from a show, and the allegations meant that his relationship with most of his family had entered territory there was no obvious way back from. Matthew Jeremiah Brown was born on September 7, 1982, in Fort Worth, Texas. His father, Billy, relocated the family to a remote stretch of the Alaska Panhandle when Matt was still a toddler, settling in a place where the nearest town required a 20-minute boat ride to reach. Matt grew up without a school building, without neighborhood kids, and with almost no contact with the outside world. His parents homeschooled all 7 children, and the family called themselves a wolf pack, a unit that existed almost entirely on its own terms. When Alaskan Bush People premiered on May 6, 2014, Matt became the talkative eldest son, the survival expert, the warm and rough presence who carried the family's identity on his shoulders and made it look effortless. By 2015, the show was pulling nearly 5 million viewers, and Matt was a genuine reason for those numbers. Behind the cameras, however, the family was staying at lodges between filming sessions rather than the remote homestead the show kept presenting as their permanent home. A grand jury indictment in 2014 for falsifying permanent fund dividend applications confirmed what critics had long been saying, that the born wild, never-tamed identity was at minimum significantly constructed. Matt knew all of it firsthand. He performed the constructed version of himself for season after season anyway, and if you have ever had to perform a version of yourself that is not entirely honest, even for understandable reasons, you already understand the kind of weight that accumulates behind that performance over years and what it eventually costs the person doing it. The man who grew up performing a manufactured identity for millions of strangers was the same man who ended up sleeping alone in a cemetery, and the distance between those two images is the full weight of this story. The dozens of former reality television stars who have died by suicide since the mid-2000s, with multiple tallies placing the figure at over 28 internationally, did not all die for identical reasons. But a pattern runs through many of their stories. These shows extract drama from real human beings, build audiences around their vulnerabilities, and then release those people back into ordinary life with no support structure and a level of public scrutiny that follows them permanently. Matt had his addiction, his estrangement, and his grief, but he was also carrying the specific and almost never discussed burden of being the only person in his family willing to say out loud that the story they had all been performing was never entirely real. The honesty that isolated him from his family and cost him his place on the show was the same honesty that made the people who genuinely followed him on YouTube feel like they actually knew him. He built a community out of his willingness to be truthful about his failures, and then watched portions of that same community use that vulnerability as a target. Bear made clear in the days after Matt's death that those comments had landed in a way that went very deep. His mother, Ami, was still recovering from COVID and pneumonia when her eldest son died. The family that millions of Americans watched build fires and catch fish together on their Friday nights is now sitting with a loss that no camera could ever properly frame. Matt Brown was 43 years old, the eldest of 7, and the only one who stood up and said the story his family sold to millions of viewers was never entirely real. He paid a price for that honesty that almost nobody watching from their couch would ever have stopped to calculate. The people who loved him and the millions of strangers who watched him through a screen and told themselves they truly knew who he was are only now beginning to sit with the possibility that they may never have fully known him at all.